1. You need to recommend a strategy for migrating the database content of Web App 1 to Azure. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the SQL servers to Azure. B. Use SQL Server Transactional Replication. C. Copy the BACPAC file that contains the Azure SQL database file to Azure Blob Storage. D. Copy the VHD that contains the Azure SQL database files to Azure Blob Storage. Answer: D. 2. You need to recommend a strategy for the web tier of Web App 1. The solution must minimize. What should you recommend? A. Create a runbook that resizes virtual machines automatically to a smaller size outside of business hours. B. Configure the scale-up settings for a web app. C. Deploy a virtual machine scale set that scales out on a 75% CPU threshold. D. Configure the scale-out settings for a web app. Answer: D. 3. What should you include in the identity management strategy to support the planned changes? A. Move all the domain controllers from corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. B. Deploy domain controllers for corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. C. Deploy a new Azure AD tenant for the authentication of new R&D projects. D. Deploy domain controllers for the rd.fabricam.com forest to virtual networks in Azure. Answer: B. 4. You need to recommend a notification solution for the IT support distribution group. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Network Watcher. B. An action group. C. A SendGrid account with advanced reporting. D. Azure AD Connect Health. Answer: D. 5. You need to recommend a data storage strategy for Web App 1. What should you include in the recommendation? A. An Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool. B. A vCore BASWL Azure SQL Database. C. An Azure Virtual Machine that runs SQL Server. D. A fixed-size DTU Azure SQL Database. Answer: B. 6. You need to recommend a solution for the collection of security logs, the middle tier of the payment processing system. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Notification Hubs. B. The Azure Diagnostics Agent. C. Azure Event Hubs. D. The Azure Log Analytics Agent. Answer: D. 7. You need to recommend a disaster recovery solution for the back-end tier of the payment processing system. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Always-on failover cluster instances. B. Active geo-replication. C. Azure Site Recovery. D. An auto failover group. Answer: D. 8. You need to recommend a backup solution for the data store of the payment processing system. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Microsoft System Center Data Protection Manager (DPM). B. Azure Backup Server. C. Azure SQL Long-Term Backup Retention. D. Azure Managed Disks. Answer: C. 9. You need to recommend a compute solution for the middle tier of the payment processing system. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Kubernetes Service (AKS). B. Virtual machine scale sets. C. Availability sets. D. App Service Environments (ASEs). Answer B. 10. You need to recommend a solution for the network configuration of the front-end tier of the payment processing. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Application Gateway. B. Traffic Manager. C. A standard load balancer. D. A basic load balancer. Answer C.